In the summer of 2003, Ethan Callahan felt like he had finally conquered the mountain he'd been climbing for nearly a decade. At 26 years old, after years of grueling all-nighters legal briefs and relentless self-discipline, he passed the California bar exam. For most people in the legal world, it's the final gate to a career of prestige and purpose. For Ethan, it was supposed to be the beginning of everything he had worked toward late nights, surrounded by casebooks, early mornings with cold coffee and flashcards, and a social life sacrificed at the altar of ambition. So, when he got that passing score, he didn't just feel proud, he felt euphoric. He spent the next few days celebrating with friends and family, toasting with flutes of champagne in overpriced restaurants, trying to soak in every bit of relief and triumph. But that euphoria turned to dust faster than he could have imagined. Just 1 week later, Ethan was supposed to meet his mother and younger brother for lunch at a diner they used to frequent in Midtown Sacramento. She had raised them alone after their father's sudden passing over a decade earlier, and despite their busy lives, they kept close. But on that particular day, they were late, both of them. It wasn't like them to be no-shows, and when Ethan's calls went unanswered, a quiet anxiety started to grow in the pit of his stomach. Then his phone rang. It was his younger brother's voice, trembling, trying and failing to hold it together. Their mom had collapsed at home while getting ready to meet him. The paramedics arrived, quickly rushed her into emergency surgery, but it was already too late. A brain aneurysm, massive and sudden. The doctor said she probably didn't suffer, that it happened in an instant. That small comfort didn't mean much in the face of the devastation that followed. The emotional whiplash was staggering. One day, he was on top of the world, finally ready to begin his future. The next, he was buried under the weight of grief, reeling from the loss of the one person he most wanted to share his success with. The days that followed were a blur of sobbing paperwork and vodka. His grandfather and aunt took over the funeral planning because neither Ethan nor his brother could function. The bottle became his coping mechanism. Champagne gave way to plastic bottles of discount liquor, and celebration became sedation. And when the haze lifted, when the booze couldn't quiet his thoughts anymore, he was left with a kind of existential silence that clawed at the edges of his identity. What was the point of all the sacrifice if life could just snatch everything away in an instant? What was he chasing? The victory felt hollow. His inbox was flooded with congratulatory emails from law school mentors and colleagues who had no idea what had happened. They wanted to meet up and celebrate, unaware that he couldn't even get out of bed. He knew their intentions were kind, but their words rang empty. He wasn't angry at them, just tired, lost, and drowning in a grief he couldn't seem to talk about. And that's when he realized he couldn't stay. Not in the city, not surrounded by legal offices, billboards for accident attorneys, and the overwhelming buzz of people who expected him to just get back to it. He needed a reset, somewhere quiet, somewhere far away from everything he knew. Ethan started scouring the internet for opportunities that could take him off-grid just for a while. That's when he stumbled upon an obscure Forest Service job listing seasonal fire lookout, a solitary post at the top of a remote mountain. No electricity, no running water, just binoculars or radio, and the responsibility of watching for signs of wildfire. It was strange, romantic, a little extreme, and it felt exactly like what he needed, a place to disappear, a place to feel something real. He bookmarked the job and whispered aloud almost instinctively, "Maybe this is where I start over." The more Ethan thought about that fire lookout position, the more it called to him like a whisper through the trees. It wasn't just the remoteness that attracted him. It was the promise of silence, of stillness, of something untouched by death or expectation. He imagined waking up to birdsong instead of buzzing phones, watching clouds drift over miles of pine instead of scanning legal contracts for technicalities. It was escapism, yes, but it also felt like the kind of raw solitude that might somehow burn the grief out of him, or at least force him to face it. And so, late one night, with a near-empty bottle of vodka at his side and his laptop screen glowing in the dark, he clicked apply. Getting the job wasn't as easy as he'd thought. Fire lookout roles, especially in wildfire-prone states like Oregon, were surprisingly competitive. They weren't just looking for warm bodies to sit in a cabin. The Forest Service wanted calm, self-sufficient individuals who could handle intense isolation, navigate wilderness maps, operate radios, and stay vigilant through long stretches of mental silence. Ethan's legal background wasn't exactly standard for the position, but he leaned into his strengths, highlighting his independent work ethic, eye for detail, and mental resilience. He took a crash course in basic first aid, passed a background check, and completed several online modules on fire spotting and emergency protocols. He even studied topographic maps and learned how to use an Osborne Firefinder, an old-school device used to triangulate the location of smoke plumes from miles away. He wasn't just running anymore. He was preparing. Weeks passed, and then finally the call came. He had been assigned to a seasonal post at Table Rock Lookout, deep in the Umatilla National Forest in northeastern Oregon. The gig would last from June through mid-September. The ranger on the other end of the line warned him bluntly, "No power, no plumbing. Cell service is spotty at best. You'll be alone up there." "You sure you're cut out for this?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said, because for the first time in weeks, he truly meant it. It was the first decision that hadn't come from pain or pressure, but from some strange, still place deep inside him. As he packed up for the summer, he left his law books behind. What went into his duffel instead were hiking boots, a sleeping bag, jugs for hauling water batteries, and a couple of notebooks he intended to fill with whatever spilled from his thoughts in that tower. He told no one where he was going, not even close friends. There was something sacred about the secrecy, about disappearing into the woods without explanation. When he finally drove out of Sacramento and toward the Pacific Northwest, the freeway felt like a river carrying him not just away from his past, but into something unknown. He didn't know what he was looking for at the top of Table Rock. Peace, closure, redemption. All he knew was that whatever waited for him in that cabin in the sky, it had to be different than everything he'd left behind. The road to Table Rock was as wild and winding as Ethan had hoped. As he drove deeper into northeastern Oregon, the rolling hills of the Columbia Plateau gave way to dense thickets of pine and fir. The GPS dropped out somewhere past La Grande, and from there, it was just Ethan, an old Forest Service map, and miles of gravel road stretching into the heart of the Umatilla National Forest. By the time he reached the base of the lookout, dusk had settled over the hills like a wool blanket. The tower itself wasn't exactly majestic, just a boxy structure perched on a 10-foot concrete base with weatherproof siding and metal shutters. But to Ethan, it looked like a fortress, a stronghold above the world. Somewhere grief might not be able to follow. Waiting for him was Ranger Don Halbert, a leathery man in his 60s with a Forest Service cap and a handshake like sandpaper. He didn't ask why Ethan was taking the job, just walked him through the basics like he'd done 100 times before. The essentials were sparse: a propane stove, a battery-powered radio, a cot chemical toilet, and the Firefinder, a metal disc mounted in the middle of the room used for triangulating smoke. The cabin itself was snug, just 14 by 14 feet, with windows on all sides, offering a 360-degree view of the surrounding wilderness. "You'll either love the quiet or lose your damn mind," Don said with a crooked grin, before handing Ethan the keys and disappearing down the trail in his old pickup. And then he was alone. At first, the solitude was refreshing. Each morning began with instant coffee on the stove and a long, slow walk around the catwalk. Binoculars in hand, scanning the treetops for anything out of place. From that height, he could see for miles south to the snowy Wallowas west, toward the Columbia Basin, and east all the way to the jagged Seven Devils across the Idaho border. The landscape stretched out like a living map, and for the first time in weeks, Ethan felt the static in his brain begin to clear. There were no court dates, no unread condolences, no endless loops of what if. Just wind through the pines and the occasional crackle of the radio. But peace, like everything else, came in cycles. By the third week, the silence had begun to press in from all sides. No voices, no human presence. Just the steady chirp of insects, the rustle of animals in the underbrush, and the low hum of wind through aluminum siding. Ethan had always thought of himself as introverted, but this was something else entirely. There were days when he didn't speak a single word out loud. The radio mostly stayed quiet, unless he initiated a check-in. He wrote pages in his notebook, pages of thoughts, memories of his mom, questions he couldn't answer. Sometimes he'd read them back and barely recognize himself in the words. And then there were the nights. When the sun dipped below the trees and the sky ignited with stars, Ethan would lie awake staring at the black ceiling, listening for sounds that weren't supposed to be there. It wasn't paranoia, at least, not at first. It was just a sense that the forest, as beautiful as it was, wasn't entirely empty. There were moments when a branch cracked too sharply, when shadows moved just a little too quickly, when the silence itself felt charged, like the seconds before a lightning strike. He tried to chalk it up to isolation, or maybe leftover stress from the months before, but part of him couldn't help but wonder if he was being watched, not by animals, but by something else. Still, the routine anchored him. Wake, scan, log, repeat. Each entry in his daily journal was like a breadcrumb keeping him tethered to reality. And as long as the horizon stayed free of smoke, Ethan told himself he was doing something good, that being up here wasn't just a way to run from pain, but maybe a way to grow through it. He didn't know it then, but that fragile sense of peace was about to be shattered, and what he would find beyond it would change everything. It was a dry, hazy afternoon when Ethan first saw the figure. The kind of afternoon where the horizon shimmered with heat, and the pine needles crackled underfoot like old paper. He was doing what he always did, sweeping the valley below with his binoculars from the catwalk, moving in slow, practiced arcs. Most of the time there was nothing to see except ridgelines, tree crowns, and the occasional hawk riding the thermals. But that day, something caught his eye. A dark shape moving through a clearing about 1.5 miles down the slope, threading steadily between the pines. At first, he thought it might have been a bear, or maybe even a deer standing upright. It wouldn't have been the first time his eyes played tricks on him in the distance. But as he adjusted the focus, it became clear. This wasn't an animal. It was a person. The figure moved slowly, but deliberately, not wandering like a lost hiker might, but walking with unsettling purpose. Ethan lowered the binoculars, blinked a few times, then raised them again. Still there, a lone silhouette dressed in what looked like dark, loose clothing, almost blending into the trees. Something about it didn't sit right with him. Hiking in that sector wasn't unheard of, but it was strongly discouraged that week. Fire conditions had worsened, and just that morning, the Forest Service issued a red flag warning for the entire region. Ethan had even heard dispatch mention active burns to the southeast, 20 miles off, but still too close for comfort. He stepped inside, grabbed the radio, and keyed into base. This is Table Rock. Got a visual on a lone individual heading southeast, about 1.5 out. Can you confirm if the area's under current evac protocols? A pause crackled back, followed by a calm but firm voice. Copy, Table Rock. Be advised your sector has been under evacuation orders since 0800 hours. Red flag is active. All trail access is closed. Nearest exit is Forest Road 64, approximately 3 miles west of that position. If possible, advise the individual to evacuate immediately. Ethan's stomach dropped. Whoever was down there had no business being in that forest, especially not with fire weather this volatile. He raised the binoculars again. The figure was smaller now, still moving, still heading straight into danger. He had no way of contacting them directly. His radio wouldn't reach their frequency, and there was no cell coverage this deep in. He had an air horn in the glove box of his truck and a whistle clipped to his gear, both meant for emergencies. With no time to waste, he sprinted down to retrieve them and climbed back onto the catwalk. He blasted the air horn in 3 short bursts, then blew the whistle sharply into the wind. The figure paused finally. Ethan began waving his arms, shouting into the trees. "Evacuate! You need to turn back!" It was useless against the distance and wind, but then the figure shifted slightly westward. It wasn't much, but it was something. Ethan radioed HQ with the update and requested a patrol unit to intercept. But the reply chilled him more than the dry wind ever could. Negative table rock. No units available. Can you make it out to their location? Ethan stood frozen on the catwalk radio. Still in hand, the question from HQ echoing in his head. Can you make it out to their location? He knew the rules. Fire lookouts weren't supposed to abandon their posts unless absolutely necessary. But this wasn't a hiker ignoring signage. This was someone walking straight into a wildfire zone, unaware and alone. Ethan could already feel the weight of the decision pressing on his chest. Either he made a move or risked hearing days later about a charred body found in the woods. That image alone snapped him into motion. He scrawled a quick note in the station log 1530. Leaving post to locate individual SE of position. Will report back. Then he grabbed his backpack, already half-packed with essentials map. Water first aid kit, multi-tool flashlight, and radio. He stuffed in the air horn and whistle, laced up his boots, and clipped the binoculars to his belt. Before locking the tower behind him, he took one last scan of the horizon. No smoke yet, but the air had that sharp electrical taste, like something dangerous was just beyond the tree line. The first half-mile was drivable, so he took the ranger truck partway down a rugged fire road that twisted and dipped through thick underbrush. When the path narrowed and became impassable, he ditched the vehicle and went the rest on foot. Every step down the slope felt like it mattered. Loose rock gave way underfoot, the trail disappearing into tangles of scrub oak and pine needles. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Occasionally, the wind would whip up just enough to make the trees whisper. The temperature had climbed into the 90s, and the heat clung to his skin like a second shirt. He kept his bearings using a handheld compass, and the coordinates he had jotted down earlier pushing southeast toward the figure's last known location. As he hiked, he scanned with his binoculars every few hundred yards, pausing to blow the whistle in short bursts. Nothing. No reply. The woods remained indifferent. He radioed back to HQ to give them his location and status just in case. Their voice crackled back. Copy. Stay safe, Table Rock. Keep us posted. After nearly 30 minutes of fast hiking, Ethan crested a small ridge and paused to catch his breath. That's when he saw movement through the trees, just a flicker of motion maybe 300 yards away. He crouched and focused through the binoculars. There he was, the figure. Lean, dressed in what looked like a dark mottled shirt, trudging slowly, head low, shoulders, hunched like he was carrying something heavy, grief maybe, or something else entirely. From a distance, the man looked human enough. But something about the way he moved made Ethan's skin crawl. He cupped his hands and shouted, "Hey, you need to evacuate. There's fire risk. This area's under red flag warning." The man stopped, turned slightly, and then, without a word, he kept walking deeper into the trees. That was the moment Ethan knew this wasn't going to be a normal rescue. Ethan didn't hesitate. The man might have turned away, but Ethan wasn't about to let him disappear into the timber without a fight. He picked up his pace, half jogging down the ridge, dodging tree roots and brushing past snags as the terrain sloped unevenly beneath him. He blew his whistle again, 3 sharp notes that echoed dully through the trees. Still no response. Branches clawed at his arms as he pushed forward, the air thick with dust and pine sap. The heat had become oppressive, pressing down on him like a weighted vest. He didn't smell smoke yet, but he could feel it like something smoldering just out of reach. About 50 yards out, he finally got a clearer view. The man had stopped again, standing in a small clearing just ahead. His back was to Ethan, shoulders rising and falling slowly. Ethan slowed to a walk, raised a hand in cautious greeting. "Hey," he called out, trying to sound calm. "You're not safe out here. There's a fire warning in effect. You need to head west to Forest Road 64. No movement, not even a twitch." Ethan's boots crunched softly as he stepped closer. "Do you need help? I've got water first aid, a radio. I can get you out of here." Still nothing. He was maybe 20 feet away when the man finally shifted. It wasn't a turn exactly, more like a strange weightless pivot, as if the ground beneath him had rotated instead. What Ethan saw next stole the breath from his lungs. The man wasn't wearing a shirt. In fact, he wasn't wearing much of anything. What he'd thought was a camouflage pattern on a hunting top was actually the man's skin, mottled, scabbed, and crawling with deep oozing sores. His back was covered in clusters of dark boils, some cracked open and weeping yellow-green pus. His spine was arched unnaturally, and every breath he took seemed to shudder through his ribcage, like it was being dragged up from somewhere far below. Ethan froze. He didn't speak. He couldn't. His instincts screamed at him to back away, to run, to do anything but stay rooted there in that nightmare clearing. But something deeper kept him planted. The man turned slightly more revealing. A side profile, his face was gaunt, skeletal, the skin stretched thin over his jaw. His head was completely bald, pocked with sores just like his torso. Where teeth should have been, there was only dark gum tissue visible through a slack, cracked smile that seemed too calm, too knowing. And then came the laugh. It wasn't loud, just a single breathy chuckle that seemed to vibrate through the air. Ethan felt it in his chest, in his fingertips. He didn't know why, but it struck him harder than a scream. It was wrong, not just in sound, but in feeling, like it didn't belong in the world, like it had been borrowed from some other place. And what horrified him most wasn't that the man was laughing, but that somehow he wanted to laugh too. His lips began to curl unbidden. His chest trembled with a strange lightheaded sensation to, not fear, but something disturbingly close to joy. He blinked, tried to shake it off. "You need help," he said, but the words cracked as they left his mouth. "What are you doing out here?" The man didn't answer. Instead, his head cocked to the side as if listening to a voice Ethan couldn't hear. And then, in a moment that shattered every rule of logic Ethan had ever known, the man whispered something. A word so faint that the wind seemed to carry it away before it ever fully formed. But Ethan heard it. Worse, he said it too. "Go home." The phrase escaped his mouth without thought, like he was repeating after someone. His mind screamed, "I didn't mean to say that," but his body didn't care. His legs turned him around. His boots started walking slowly, steadily back in the direction of the lookout tower. He didn't remember choosing to leave. He didn't remember making the decision to abandon the man. But he walked anyway. And the worst part, he didn't want to stop. It was like something had taken hold of him, not violently, not even maliciously, but with a calm, soothing certainty. A silent voice that said, "You've seen enough. Go now." The forest blurred around him as he climbed the ridge in a daze, the air horn dangling uselessly at his side. It wasn't until the tower came back into view that the spell began to break. His breath came in hard gasps. His hand shook as he fumbled with the key. He slammed the door shut and locked it, heart-hammering eyes wide, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. There was nothing. Only the stillness. But the words still echoed in his mind. Go home. And for the first time since arriving on Table Rock, Ethan truly questioned whether he had ever been alone up there at all. Ethan spent that night in the lookout cabin with the lights on, the door locked, and his radio clutched tightly in one hand. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the siding made his skin crawl. He didn't sleep. Couldn't. His mind replayed the encounter in the woods over and over, but each time the memory seemed clearer, more vivid, not hazier like a dream should be. The way the man had stood there still and silent, the boils pulsing in rhythm with each breath, the smile that didn't feel human, those details haunted Ethan like photographs burned into the backs of his eyelids. And worst of all was the feeling that he had been made to leave, that those words, "go home," hadn't come from his own thoughts, but from somewhere else. A place he hadn't invited, but that had somehow found its way inside him. By sunrise, he knew he couldn't stay. He thumbed the radio, and with a voice as steady as he could manage, told HQ he was resigning his post, citing mental health concerns. When they asked for more details, he hesitated for only a moment before telling them the truth. About the man in the woods, about the skin, the laughter, the whisper. There was a long pause on the other end, long enough that Ethan thought the signal had dropped before the supervisor responded in a quieter voice. "We take these things seriously. We'll have someone relieve you tomorrow morning. Hang tight." Ethan nodded to no one and hung up. The next 24 hours were the longest of his life. He went through the motions scanning the horizon, logging weather conditions, but his eyes kept drifting to the tree line expecting movement. He didn't step out on the catwalk that night. He didn't want to see what might be waiting below. Instead, he sat by the window with a flashlight on his lap, and the uneasy feeling that if he looked too long into the darkness, something might look back. And as the wind howled over Table Rock and the forest seemed to breathe beneath it, Ethan began to wonder if he had ever been meant to witness what he had seen, or if by doing so, he had crossed some invisible line that could never be uncrossed. The next morning, Ethan spotted a dust trail curling up from the base of the fire road. His relief had arrived. A beige Forest Service truck bounced into view, driven by a woman in her 40s with aviator sunglasses and a clipboard tucked under one arm. She climbed out, nodded professionally, and began checking through the handover items with practiced ease. Ethan did his best to guide her through the details, the firefinder, the logbooks, the radio equipment. But his voice trembled when he handed over the keys. The ranger looked at him for a moment, really looked, and asked gently, "You okay?" He wanted to say yes, to shrug it off as stress or burnout, but the words wouldn't come. So he just gave her a tired smile and said, "It's been a rough stretch." She didn't press further. Maybe she'd seen that look before. Maybe she knew better than to ask too many questions when it came to strange things in the woods. Ethan climbed into his car, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles as the truck in his rearview mirror grew smaller and smaller. He didn't look back. He didn't want to. The trees swallowed the tower behind him as he descended, and a pressure he hadn't realized he'd been carrying began to lift slowly, cautiously. By the time he reached the highway, it felt like he was returning from another world, one where the laws of nature had bent just slightly, just enough to let something in that shouldn't have been there. A week later, Ethan sat in a psychiatrist's office in downtown Sacramento, staring at the beige carpet while rehearsing what he'd say. When the time came, he told her everything from the death of his mother to the man in the woods. She listened, took notes, and told him gently that it sounded like a stress-induced hallucination, a surprisingly common trauma response. Ethan nodded, but something deep inside him remained unconvinced, because no matter what the textbook said, what he'd seen on that mountain had felt real. And it still did. Ethan continued therapy over the following weeks, cycling through medication adjustments and guided sessions meant to help him process the loss of his mother. The psychiatrist remained confident in her diagnosis, a grief-triggered hallucination brought on by extreme isolation and emotional trauma. On paper, it all made sense. The logic was tidy, clinical, reassuring. But no matter how many times Ethan repeated that explanation to friends, to family, or to himself, it never quite settled. Not completely, because hallucinations were supposed to fade, weren't they? They were supposed to crumble at the edges, like dreams do in the daylight. But his memories of that man in the forest, the sickly skin, The hollow laugh, the whisper in the wind remained unnervingly sharp. Ethan could still feel the pull in his chest, that brief flicker of joy laced with dread. It haunted him, not just because of how real it felt, but because of how peaceful it had felt in the moment. And that more than anything terrified him. During one follow-up session, his doctor asked again if he believed he was to blame for his mother's death. Ethan sat in silence. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because deep down he did. That guilt had followed him into the woods, clung to his thoughts like mist. And maybe, just maybe, the thing he'd seen had been born from that guilt. Or maybe it had been waiting for someone just like him to come along. Someone grieving, someone vulnerable, someone who didn't want to go home until something made him. Years have passed since Ethan left Table Rock, but the memory hasn't dulled. He moved on mostly. A quieter life, a different career path, fewer questions from people who never really knew what to ask. But sometimes on still nights, when the wind moves just right through the trees outside his window, he hears a faint echo, like a voice carried on the air. And in that moment, the forest returns. The silence, the man, the words, "Go home." Ethan did, but part of him still wonders, was that a warning or an invitation? Garrett Whitlow had never been the kind of man who craved city lights or crowded rooms. At 35, he had spent most of his adult life choosing the quiet over the chaos, and for the past 8 years, that quiet had come in the form of Forest Service work. A seasoned fire lookout, Garrett had grown accustomed to the rhythm of solitude, spending every summer posted high above the treetops in the Umatilla National Forest. His colleagues called him the loner, not out of spite, but with a kind of admiration reserved for those who found peace, where others found only silence. He wasn't running from anything, he just felt more himself out there. No traffic, no deadlines, just the scent of pine, the creak of old timber beneath his boots, and a rifle passed down from his grandfather. In that high perch, he found a freedom most people never understood and never dared to seek. Every summer, Garrett returned to the same place that felt more like home than any four walls ever had, his fire lookout tower at Timberline Ridge. Perched atop a rugged outcrop deep within Oregon's Umatilla National Forest, the tower stood like a sentinel over miles of whispering pine and fir. With wraparound windows offering a panoramic view of the wilderness, it was both his post and his refuge. The climb up each season never got easier, hauling up crates of canned food, worn paperbacks, a rusted coffee pot, and his grandfather's Winchester. But the reward was worth it. Out there, time moved differently. Mornings came with golden light, slicing through the trees. Evenings melted into sweeping skies, brushed in orange and purple. To Garrett, it wasn't just a job, it was a sacred trust. He was there to watch, to protect, and to become part of the land itself. From that wooden perch, he felt both insignificant and essential. A quiet guardian in a world that had long forgotten the power of listening to the wind. By the time Garrett settled into his tower that June, the forest had fully awakened from its winter hush. He unpacked, slowly falling back into the rhythm he knew by heart, lining up his canned goods, setting his battered journal on the windowsill, checking the radio for static or stray chatter. Mornings were spent scanning the horizon for smoke logging temperatures and wind speeds into a notebook that no one but he seemed to read. Afternoons brought strong coffee, long stretches of silence, and the occasional visit from a red-tailed hawk soaring just beyond the rail. And at night, when the air cooled and the sun dipped low behind the ridgeline, Garrett would sit out on the deck, watching the trees sway like waves under the last light of day. It was a life most people couldn't fathom. No internet, no traffic, no conversations beyond the occasional radio call from HQ, but to Garrett, it was paradise. He didn't need much. The creak of the wood, the scent of fir needles baking in the sun, the distant chatter of squirrels. It was all enough. He felt lucky, even honored to witness nature this closely. But as the days passed, a faint unease began to creep in, something just under the surface, not quite right, though he couldn't yet name it. It started as little more than a whisper, something Garrett could almost dismiss as imagination. But the more time he spent out on the deck, with his morning coffee or pacing the ridgeline, with binoculars in hand, the more he began to notice it. The forest had gone quiet. Not the natural hush that sometimes comes before a summer storm, but a deeper, unnatural stillness. No bird calls, no rustle of squirrels. Even the wind seemed to tread carefully through the trees. Garrett had been doing this long enough to know that the forest had moods. But this wasn't a mood, it was a warning. The feeling was subtle at first, a prickle at the base of his neck, the sense that someone or something was watching him from just beyond the tree line. He tried to shake it off, blaming the isolation, but the feeling persisted. Then one morning he found a pile of fresh scat, not far from the tower, and claw marks carved deep into a cedar trunk. Possibly a mountain lion. Garrett began slinging his old Winchester over his shoulder every time he left the tower just in case. He still completed his daily routines, logging weather, hauling water, checking the rain gauge. But now he did them all with a hand on his rifle and one eye always scanning the trees. Each night, he started locking the tower door, something he'd never bothered with before. Still, he told himself it was all in his head, that the forest was just being the forest. But deep down, he knew better. Something had changed. Weeks passed, with the tension hanging like fog over Timberline Ridge. Garrett tried to convince himself it was nothing, just the effects of too much time alone. His nerves wound too tight from the silence. But the sense of being watched never faded, and the forest's unnatural stillness clung to him like a second skin. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it lifted. The birds returned with their bright songs, and a small herd of mule deer wandered into the clearing. One morning, grazing without a care. The air felt lighter, and Garrett finally allowed himself to exhale. He even laughed at his own paranoia, blaming it on the quiet and too many mystery novels. Still, he kept the rifle close, more out of habit than fear. It was a late afternoon in August, warm, but shaded beneath the dense canopy near a creek about a half-mile from the tower. Garrett had gone down to check the water levels, crouching near the mossy rocks to log a few notes. While retightening a loose bootlace, he set his rifle against a boulder beside him. That's when he heard it, a sharp thwack, abrupt and violent, as something slammed into the tree just behind his head. He spun around, heart hammering, and saw it, an arrow buried deep in the bark, its wooden shaft still trembling. Panic surged. No thinking, no hesitation, just instinct. Garrett grabbed his rifle and bolted, crashing through underbrush and ducking low branches. Lungs heaving as he sprinted back to the tower. He didn't stop until he slammed the door shut and through the locked chest, heaving, hands trembling. He grabbed the radio with clumsy fingers, barely steady enough to press the mic. "HQ, this is Lookout 7, he gasped. "Someone just tried to shoot me with an arrow. I need backup now." For the first time in years, Garrett felt truly unsafe in the place he'd once called sanctuary. The response from HQ came swiftly, calm, but serious. "Copy that, Lookout 7. Sit tight, we're sending a team your way." Garrett didn't move from his post by the west-facing window. Rifle in hand, he scanned the tree line, every shifting shadow a threat, every snap of a twig a warning. Minutes dragged like hours. He'd spent years in this tower, felt at peace with its creaks and groans, but now every sound set his nerves on edge. When the backup finally arrived, 3 armed rangers in a dusty green Jeep Garrett bolted down to meet them, legs still shaky from the run and the fear. Together they returned to the creek, each step deeper into the forest, feeling heavier than the last. The arrow was still there, jutting from the tree, a grim reminder of how close he'd come to dying. The rangers fanned out, combing the area for signs, footprints, broken branches. Anything, but the forest, thick with pine needles, yielded no answers. One of the rangers examined the arrow, and murmured that it looked handmade, primitive even. Maybe a poacher, he suggested, or someone with a bone to pick with the feds. But no one sounded convinced. Whoever it was had vanished as silently as they'd come, leaving behind only mystery and the lingering chill of a near-death encounter. For the next 2 days, the Rangers stayed with Garrett, taking shifts on the lookout deck with rifles ready, their eyes constantly sweeping the forest below. But nothing else happened. No second arrow. No movement in the trees. No sound beyond the usual chatter of squirrels and the wind brushing through the pines. Whoever had taken that shot had disappeared without a trace. By the end of the second day, the team had no choice but to leave their presence needed elsewhere. Garrett was left alone again, but something had shifted. The silence that once felt sacred now carried a different weight, heavier, uncertain. He still performed his duties, but each step outside the tower felt more like a gamble. He double-checked the locks every night and kept his rifle by the bed, no longer out of habit, but necessity. The rest of the season dragged on in this strange purgatory. The peace he once cherished had become fragile, and though no new threat revealed itself, the unease never lifted. Garrett realized that the most unnerving part wasn't the arrow itself. It was the absence of answers. No tracks, no confrontation, no message. Just a single precise shot and a vanishing presence that left the forest forever changed. When September rolled in and the first cold rain swept across Timberline Ridge, Garrett packed up his gear and descended the mountain with quieter steps than usual. The tower, his sanctuary for 5 long summers, no longer felt like home. It was still there, unchanged in its weathered beams and sweeping views, but something unspoken had taken root in its silence. As he made the slow hike back down through the forest, every gust of wind through the branches sounded like breath on his neck. Every shadow between the trunks seemed just a little too deep. He couldn't explain it to the other rangers at HQ without sounding paranoid, so he kept it to himself, offering only a short report and a tired nod. The season had ended without further incident, but Garrett knew the story wasn't finished. Something had entered his world up there, something that watched, waited, and vanished without a sound. He left the mountain, but not the feeling. It clung to him, buried somewhere between instinct and memory. Even as the leaves turned and snow dusted the peaks, he couldn't shake the sense that the forest had shown him a darker truth, one it had been keeping just out of sight. Years have passed since that summer on Timberline Ridge, but Garrett still remembers the sound, that sharp, unmistakable thwack of the arrow striking bark inches from his skull. It echoes in his mind sometimes, uninvited on quiet nights, when the wind rustles through the pines just right. He still returns to the towers every season, still walks the ridgelines with binoculars and rifle in tow. But something in him changed after that day. The forest hasn't spoken since, but Garrett's eyes linger longer on the shadows, and his hand rests a little closer to the trigger. He doesn't tell the story often, not because he's afraid of being doubted, but because he still doesn't understand it himself. The wilderness had always been his refuge, a place of peace. But now, buried beneath the beauty, he knows something else waits silent, watching, and just out of reach. Eli Barrett was 30 years old when the story at Ashfall Ridge began. But, despite 6 years in the U.S. Forest Service, he still considered himself a student, compared to the likes of Franklin Mallory. Frank was the kind of ranger who seemed etched into the wilderness itself, rugged, reliable, and quiet. In that way, only mountain men truly are. At 59, Frank had spent 3 decades patrolling the Cascade National Forest, and over the years had become a legend among younger rangers. Eli always felt a quiet admiration for the older man, not just for his survival skills or backwoods knowledge, but for the calm steadiness he brought to every situation. Frank wasn't a storyteller or a show-off. He was the kind of guy who said little. But when he did speak, people listened. He'd weathered countless wildfires, blizzards, and black bear encounters without losing his nerve. To Eli, Frank wasn't just a coworker, he was a mentor, a symbol of what it meant to be a true steward of the forest. And when Frank volunteered to man the Ashfall Tower that summer, no one questioned it. It was just what Frank did, keeping watch from the ridgeline while the rest of the world carried on below. Ashfall Ridge wasn't marked on most tourist maps. Tucked deep in the Cascade National Forest of Oregon, it was a stretch of wilderness that belonged more to time than to people. The elevation was steep, the air thin and sharp, and the trails mostly forgotten, except by a few veteran rangers and the occasional black-tailed deer. It was here, perched on a rocky outcrop, 2 hours' drive up narrow Forest Service roads, that Ashfall Tower stood, an aging fire lookout that seemed more relic than resource. Built from timber and steel in the late 1950s, the tower had weathered storms, wildfires, and the slow creep of moss across its legs. And that summer of 1997, it was Frank Mallory who took up the watch once more. To Eli, it felt fitting. If there was one place in the entire forest that matched Frank's silent endurance, it was Ashfall. The tower was remote, exposed to harsh elements, and surrounded by ridgelines that echoed with wind and the occasional crack of a falling limb. Frank loved it. He used to say it was the only place he could think clearly, just him, a cot, a radio, and the tree line. No chatter, no distractions. That kind of solitude wasn't for everyone, but for Frank, it seemed like peace. He made the lonely drive every June without complaint, stocked with canned beans, instant coffee, and a dog-eared paperback or two. For Frank, Ashfall Ridge was more than duty. It was sacred ground until the fire came. By early July, Ashfall Tower had settled into its usual rhythm, and so had Frank. Every morning, like clockwork, his voice would crackle over the radio, steady, no nonsense, and reassuring. Ashfall all clear. Weather's holding. For the team back at the ranger station hearing, Frank's daily check-in was as normal as the smell of burnt coffee or the rustle of topo maps. Eli found himself unconsciously looking forward to it. There was something grounding about knowing that Frank was up there watching the ridgeline with those sharp eyes of his. No one worried about Frank being alone. If anything, it was where he thrived. He'd say things like, "The trees don't lie to you," or "Wind tells you more than most folks ever do." It was the kind of wisdom that only made sense out there, surrounded by thousands of acres of pine and silence. And while the tower creaked in the wind and chipmunks rustled beneath the floorboards, Frank stayed vigilant, binoculars in hand. Boots always laced, scanning the horizon for the faintest trace of smoke. Everything about that summer felt like routine, predictable, safe, but routine has a way of lulling even the most seasoned watchmen, and what none of them knew. What Frank couldn't have known was that something was already stirring in the distance. The call came in on July 21st, late in the afternoon. Eli was at the station, half listening to a weather report while updating a visitor log, when the radio crackled to life with a burst of static, louder, harsher than usual. Then came Frank's voice, but it wasn't the calm, measured tone they were used to. It was sharp, panicked, urgent. "Ashfall Tower. I've got a fire moving in fast. From the southwest, winds are picking up. Might have to evac." There was a pause, a stammer of breath, then more quietly, "It's moving too quick. I've got to move." And just like that, the transmission cut out. Eli and the others froze. In all his years, he'd never heard Frank sound like that. The man had reported wildfires before, sometimes dangerously close, but this was different. Within minutes, the team had mobilized. Spotter planes were launched, ground crews were activated, and Eli was assigned to a search group heading straight for Ashfall Ridge. The strange thing was, there had been no lightning strikes reported. No smoke sightings, nothing that should have sparked a blaze. But by nightfall, flames were already visible in the distance, flickering above the treetops like hellish flags. The fire was fast, unnaturally fast. Eli had seen dry summers before, but this was something else entirely. The ridge lit up in waves, trees vanishing in pillars of smoke, as hot wind blew ash in their faces. As the sun sank, the forest transformed into a blackened battlefield, and the sky turned a bruised orange. The last anyone had heard from Frank was that one broken call. He knew those woods better than anyone, but even the most seasoned ranger can only run so far when the fire comes from all sides. And now, no one could reach him. For 2 straight days, the fire raged across Ashfall Ridge, like a living thing, hungry, relentless, and faster than anything they'd seen in years. By the time crews managed to contain the worst of it, the once verdant slope had become a smoldering graveyard of blackened stumps and scorched earth. Ash Spire Tower was gone completely. Nothing left but a collapsed skeleton of charred beams and twisted steel where the lookout cabin used to stand. And that would have been tragic enough, but it wasn't the part that truly rattled the crew. Frank's truck was still parked at the trailhead. That detail hit Eli like a punch to the gut. If Frank had evacuated, he would have driven out, no question. He was too practical, too experienced to leave his vehicle behind in a crisis. Worse still, there was no sign he'd left a message, no radio contact since the initial call. It was like he'd vanished into the smoke. The following morning, the head ranger ordered a full-scale search and rescue. Eli joined the 8-person team that fanned out through the outer perimeter, calling Frank's name into a silence that felt too heavy for sound to carry. The ground was still hot under their boots, and every step kicked up ash like snowflakes from a haunted blizzard. What struck Eli most was the absence of life. No birds, no squirrels, not even insects. Just the creak of dead branches and the far-off hiss of dying embers. It wasn't just destruction, it was as if something had hollowed the place out. They searched the area around the tower, the ravines, the game trails, anywhere a man might have fled. And though hope was fading fast, something in Eli refused to believe Frank was gone. Not yet. Not like this. But the woods weren't giving up their secrets easily. They found Frank by accident. Late in the afternoon, on the second day of the search, one of the tracking dogs began barking, furiously, pulling its handler toward a narrow ravine about a mile downslope from where Ash Spire Tower had once stood. Eli heard the commotion and sprinted through the ash and soot, heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. When he reached the edge of the ravine, he saw 2 team members already scrambling down the slope, and that's when he caught a glimpse of something movement among the rocks and fallen limbs below. Frank was there, sprawled at the bottom like a discarded doll, legs twisted at unnatural angles, his skin covered in soot and streaks of dried blood. But he was alive, barely. His eyes flicked wildly unfocused, scanning the treetops like he still expected the fire to return. He didn't seem to recognize anyone at first. His lips moved, muttering something over and over, too faint to understand. Eli descended into the ravine with the others, and they worked quickly to stabilize him and prepare for extraction. But then Frank started to vomit. Thick black sludge poured from his mouth, sooty tar-like with chunks of something solid mixed in. The smell was unbearable, burned meatwood smoke and something chemical that stung the eyes. Eli turned away, gagging. When they finally got Frank onto the stretcher and hauled him back up the slope, the medevac team was already inbound. By the time the chopper lifted off, Frank was drifting in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow and erratic. Later, the doctors would say they'd never seen anything like it. They pumped his stomach and found partially digested bark cinders and tree ash like someone had eaten a campfire. No one could explain it. Not hunger, not delirium. Just wrong. And Frank. He didn't explain it either. He just lay in the ICU bed, skin-gray lips, dry hands trembling. Whatever had happened in those woods, whatever he'd seen or done, it had broken something in him. And for Eli, that was the moment the story changed. This wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of something much darker, something that had followed Frank out of the fire. It was 3 days later in a sterile hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and quiet dread when Eli finally heard what had happened. The head ranger, Bill Connolly, had asked Eli to accompany him for the visit, maybe hoping Frank would open up to someone he trusted. Frank looked like a shell of the man they'd pulled out of the ravine, his beard trimmed short by the nurse's skin, still ashen, eyes hollow. His legs were in casts, and his voice was barely more than a whisper. But when Bill asked him gently what had happened out there, Frank didn't hesitate. "I saw something," he said, staring not at them, but at the ceiling above. "After the fire moved through, I went back to the tower, or what was left of it. Everything was scorched. Ground still smoking. Ash in the air like snow. And then I saw it." Frank paused, his lips trembling slightly. It wasn't human. Big but thin. Like a bear but sick. Black all over like it had been burned too, but still moving. Its skin was hanging in strips, and it was eating the ash, just scooping it up and shoveling it into its mouth like it was starving. Bill shifted in his chair, eyes narrowing. Eli said nothing. Frank continued, his tone distant, mechanical. "I didn't move. I just watched. I should have run. But then it turned its head. No eyes, just holes. But it saw me. I swear it saw me." A long silence filled the room. And then Bill asked. "I ran," Frank said, voice cracking. "Didn't think, didn't look. I just ran. My legs went out from under me. I don't even remember falling." Neither Bill nor Eli pressed further. What could they say? Frank had never been one for tall tales, and he sure as hell wasn't the type to scare easy. But the fear in his voice wasn't put on. It was real. Whatever Frank had seen on that ridge hadn't just burned the land, it had burned itself into him. And Eli couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't done yet. Something had watched him through Frank's eyes, and maybe, just maybe, it was still watching. Frank was discharged from the hospital a few weeks later, but he didn't return to the ranger station. He didn't even say goodbye. Word came down that he'd officially filed for early retirement, 30 years of service, just like that over. The department threw a small farewell cookout at the end of the season, but Frank never showed. Eli wasn't surprised. He'd seen the change in him. Whatever fire had once burned behind Frank's eyes had dimmed to ash. The man who used to trek 10 miles before breakfast now leaned heavily on a cane and flinched at the sound of rustling leaves. Frank bought a small cabin about an hour from the forest boundary, tucked behind a gravel road no one ever used. Some of the rangers said he spent his days fishing in the creek or tinkering with old tools in his shed. But Eli knew better. Frank hadn't escaped the ridge, he'd just moved far enough to breathe without choking on memory. Eli visited once, just after winter thaw. Frank was thinner, his beard stark white, his expression flat and distant. When Eli brought up Ashspire Tower, Frank's face stiffened. "I'm fine," he said, but didn't meet Eli's eyes. He changed the subject and talked instead about trout patterns and whether, like the woods, no longer existed. What lingered wasn't what Frank had seen, it was what had stayed with him. Eli could feel it in the silence between words, in the way Frank kept glancing toward the trees, like he was waiting or watching. The last time Eli saw Frank was in the fall of 1999, inside a quiet grocery store on the outskirts of town. Frank looked older, more weathered, his frame thinner, his movements slower, like each step carried a weight that wasn't entirely physical. He still leaned on that same old cane, wore a worn flannel over a faded shirt, and managed a tired smile when he saw Eli. They exchanged pleasantries, small talk about the Forest Service fishing, the early chill creeping into the Oregon air. For a moment, it felt almost normal. But then Eli, without thinking, mentioned Ashfall Ridge. He didn't say much, just an offhand comment about how the trees had finally started growing back. And that's when Frank's expression changed. His jaw tensed, eyes darkening as they drifted toward the store's front window. He stared out at the distant silhouette of the mountains, like he was seeing something far beyond the horizon. And then, barely above a whisper, he said, "Don't go up there." That was it. No explanation, no farewell. He turned and shuffled off down the aisle without another word. Eli stood there, goosebumps rising. It was a warning, not a memory. And it was clear whatever haunted Frank hadn't stayed behind in the fire. Years have passed since that brief encounter in the grocery store, but Frank's words have never left Eli. Don't go up there. At the time, it felt like a final plea, something said by a man still nursing wounds too deep for the eye to see. But the older Eli gets, the more those words settle in his bones, like the chill of early snow. Frank died in the spring of 2004, peacefully according to the obituary, but Eli always wondered what his last night was like, whether he slept soundly or stared out the window until dawn, waiting for the shape in the tree line to reappear. The Forest Service eventually rebuilt the lookout near Ashfall Ridge, a smaller, more modern structure with solar panels and a steel frame. Young recruits occasionally take shifts up there, reporting clear skies and uneventful nights. But Eli never returned. He turned down every assignment that took him anywhere near that part of the forest. Some of the younger staff laugh off the old stories, chalking them up to heat stroke or smoke inhalation. And maybe they're right. Maybe that's all it was, a fire too fast, a mind too tired, a man too alone. But Eli remembers Frank. He remembers the black sludge, the hollow eyes, the stench of burnt earth still clinging to Frank's skin days after he'd been rescued. He remembers the way the woods fell silent, like nature itself was holding its breath. And most of all, he remembers the look in Frank's eyes. Not fear of death, but fear of something that had survived it. Eli doesn't tell the story often, but when he does, he ends it the same way Frank did. Don't go up there, because some places burn more than just trees. Some places leave their mark on your soul. And so, Ashfall Ridge remains just another name on a map, quiet beneath the pines. But for those who knew Frank Mallory, and for Eli Barrett, who still dreams of black ash and hollow eyes, it's more than a ridgeline. It's a warning. Not everything that survives the fire comes out clean. And some things once awakened never truly go back to sleep. Drawn to stories that linger in your mind long after they end. Join our growing community by subscribing, liking, and hitting the notification bell. We dive deep into the eerie, the unexplained, and the forgotten, bringing you true stories that blur the line between reality and the unknown. Every bit of support helps us continue uncovering tales that deserve to be told, no matter how strange or chilling they may be. Stick around, there's so much more waiting in the shadows.